In late August 1941, a heavy, almost palpable silence hung over the waters of the Baltic, broken only occasionally by the distant rumble of cannon fire. The city of Tallinn, ancient Reval, choked in a ring of encirclement, and its gray towers seemed to gaze pleadingly at the sea, the only path that still remained open. On the port's piers, thousands of people stood in cramped anxiety, soldiers in sweat-soaked tunics, civilian specialists with small suitcases, women clutching frightened children, and wounded whose bandages had long been permeated with salty sea dust. All of them awaited salvation from the advancing Wehrmacht units, hoping that the might of the Baltic Fleet would be a reliable shield on their way to Kronstadt. None of them at that moment suspected that ahead of them lay not just a passage by sea, but one of the most controversial and arduous trials in the history of navigation, which would later be called a tragedy comparable to the greatest upheavals of the past. The events of those days began in an atmosphere of rapidly changing reality, as the familiar world crumbled under the blows of tank wedges. Tallinn, in the strategic plans of that time, occupied a key position, being the main base of the fleet, and its retention was considered a matter of honor and military necessity. However, by the end of August, the situation became critical. The enemy cut off land communications, and the city turned into a besieged fortress, pressed against the cold waves of the bay. The question of withdrawing ships and evacuating the garrison was extremely acute, but the political leadership in Moscow demanded holding positions until the last moment, which created conditions for an inevitable organizational collapse. When the order to retreat was finally received, there was practically no time left for systematic preparation, and this predetermined the coming chaos, in which the professionalism of individual sailors clashed with the systemic powerlessness of the Supreme Command. The sea route from Tallinn to Leningrad in those days resembled not a road, but a narrow corridor filled with invisible traps. The Gulf of Finland, already difficult for navigation, became the densest minefield in world history. German and Finnish forces made enormous efforts to seal off the Soviet fleet in the bottle of the bay, placing thousands of horned spheres beneath the water's surface. Juminda Cape became the central point of this underwater labyrinth, where the density of barriers exceeded all conceivable limits. The fleet command knew about this threat, but the available minesweepers were few and could not provide a safe passage for the huge armada, consisting of more than 200 vessels of various classes, from mighty cruisers to fragile tugs and boats. The beginning of the main fleet's movement on August 28, 1941, looked majestic and simultaneously terrifying. Huge ships, such as the cruiser Kirov, maneuvered among smaller vessels, raising high waves that swept over overcrowded barges. The air was filled with the roar of hundreds of engines, and the horizon was shrouded in smoke from burning warehouses and port facilities that Soviet troops destroyed before leaving. The main problem was that the evacuation was not a unified, clearly planned process. Transport ships, carrying tens of thousands of people, often lacked proper cover and communication with warships. This created a situation where a huge mass of people and equipment found themselves practically defenseless in the face of hidden danger lurking in the dark waters of the Baltic. The inner world of the participants in those events was filled with incredible tension and an awareness of the fragility of their own existence. Admiral Vladimir Tributes, who made key decisions, was under colossal pressure. On one hand, rigid directives from above demanded the fleet's combat readiness be preserved at all costs. On the other hand, a reality where every step forward could mean the loss of hundreds of lives. Officers on the ship's bridges peered through binoculars, trying to discern the deadly horns of mines in the glinting water, while sailors in the engine rooms worked amidst deafening noise, knowing that in the event of a hit, they would have no chance of salvation. On transport ships, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The lack of information bred rumors, and overcrowding and the realization of their own helplessness pushed people to the brink of despair. The motivation of many participants was dictated not only by duty, but also by the instinct of self-preservation, which, in wartime conditions, acquires a special acuteness. People who had abandoned their homes in Tallinn carried only the bare essentials with them, hoping to find safety in the east, but the sea offered them different rules of the game. The tragedy was that the fates of civilian refugees and wounded soldiers were in the hands of a system that, at that moment, was paralyzed by contradictory orders and a lack of resources. This created a deep personal conflict for every commander. Should they follow the letter of the order, risking the complete destruction of their vessel, or try to find alternative routes that could be even more dangerous? On an ideological level, the Tallinn Passage exposed a fundamental contradiction between the value of human life and the interests of state prestige or military strategy. Official historiography long dominated with the viewpoint that the operation was a forced but necessary maneuver to save the core of the Baltic Fleet. However, hidden behind this formulation was a bitter paradox. For the sake of preserving the steel hulls of warships, thousands of people on transport ships, which trailed at the end of the convoys and bore the brunt of the attack, were sacrificed. This clash between cynical calculation and the humanistic need to protect the weak became the main philosophical dilemma of those days. The Baltic Tsushima. This comparison arose not by chance, for, as at the beginning of the 20th century, the fleet faced not only a strong adversary, but also its own unwieldiness and systemic errors. The situation transformed at dusk on August 28th, when the lead ships reached the edge of the minefields near Cape Juminda. The first explosions sounded almost simultaneously, shattering the evening silence and turning organized movement into chaos. Huge columns of water rose to the sky, and the sea abyss began to swallow ship after ship. It was at this moment that it became clear that the initial plan for the passage had completely failed. Command lost control over the scattered groups of ships, and each captain was forced to make decisions independently based on their own intuition and luck. Flashes of fire on the horizon illuminated a terrible scene: sinking ships, hundreds of people in the water, and the incessant whistle of shrapnel. The climax came on the night of August 29th, when aerial attacks were added to the mine threat. German aviation, taking advantage of the convoy's defenselessness, began methodically shelling those ships that had managed to pass through the minefields. This was a moment of absolute truth, when masks were shed and only a pure struggle for existence remained. The huge transport Kazakhstan, with thousands of people on board, suffered heavy damage, turning into a blazing island of pain in the cold sea. Other ships, such as Veronia and Everita, sank within minutes, taking with them everyone inside. The waters of the bay were strewn with debris, lifeboats, and the bodies of those whose threads of life were cut short on that terrible night. At the same time, warships, including the cruiser Kirov, continued their eastward movement, breaking through a curtain of fire and smoke. Their armor protected them from many threats, but the moral burden of what was happening weighed on the crews more heavily than any shell. The sailors saw defenseless comrades perish in their wake, but the order demanded they go forward, without stopping to rescue, so as not to endanger the main forces of the fleet. This moment became a point of no return in the perception of the operation. The success of saving combat units was inextricably linked with the tragedy of those left to their fate. By the morning of August 29th, the remnants of the once great armada began to arrive in Kronstadt, bringing news of a catastrophe whose scale was yet to be fully comprehended. The resonance of the Tallinn Passage is felt decades later, making us reflect on the limits of responsibility and the price of victory. The lessons of those days tell us that even in the most difficult conditions, chaos and loss of control lead to losses that cannot be justified by any difficult situation. Today we understand that the tragedy at Cape Juminda was a result not only of enemy actions, but also of the system's unwillingness to acknowledge a reality different from office plans. This is a reminder that behind every number in the reports are living people whose dreams and hopes were swallowed by the waves of the Baltic. A modern understanding of these events requires us to be honest in evaluating the past, however bitter it may be, because only in this way can we pay tribute to those who did not return from that campaign. The fleet, having lost a significant part of its transport capacity, nevertheless preserved the core of its warships, which later played an important role in the defense of Leningrad. However, the price of this preservation was exorbitant. 15,000 people, by the most conservative estimates, ended their journey in the waters of the bay, and this figure will forever remain a black page in the history of navigation. The history of the Tallinn Passage teaches us that in moments of greatest trials, the human spirit manifests itself both in acts of unparalleled heroism and in the deepest falls caused by fear and indecision. Returning to the image of the quiet Baltic with which this narrative began, we now see not just a sea, but a great common grave and a monument to human resilience. Those gray towers of Tallinn that saw the fleet off on its last journey still stand today, reminding us of the cyclical nature of history and that no event passes without a trace. Tragedy and feat, chaos and discipline, all intertwined into one indissoluble knot in August 1941. The memory of this passage lives in the hearts of descendants, urging us to value every moment of peace and to realize our responsibility for those who follow us. The Baltic waves still crash against the shores of Cape Juminda, preserving the secret of those days when the sea witnessed the collapse of hopes and the birth of legends that will live as long as people remember their history. Concluding this narrative, it is important to emphasize that the true meaning of past events is revealed to us only when we stop dividing them into black and white, recognizing the full complexity of human choice in extreme conditions. The Tallinn Passage will remain in memory as an example of how technical superiority and strategic calculation can be shattered by the element of war and the shortcomings of human management. But at the same time, it is also a story about those who fought to their last breath for the lives of their comrades, who did not abandon their post in the engine room and who shared the last sip of water on a life raft. In these actions lies that indestructible spark of life that allows humanity to move forward, learning lessons from its most bitter defeats. The events at Cape Juminda became a harsh test for the entire Baltic Fleet. Mistakes made during the organization of the passage were analyzed for years, forming the basis for new textbooks on tactics and strategy. But no theoretical calculations can compensate for the loss of those souls that remained in the depths of the Gulf of Finland. History does not know the subjunctive mood, and we cannot change the orders given more than 80 years ago. We can only remember what happened and strive to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again in the future. Every year at the end of August, the waters of the Baltic receive wreaths in memory of those who did not reach Kronstadt. This is a tradition that unites generations and reminds us that the sea does not forgive mistakes, but it also does not forget its heroes. The tragedy of the Tallinn Passage has become part of our common heritage, a symbol of pain and courage that continues to resonate in the modern world, reminding us of the importance of honor, duty, and humanity. In this endless movement of waves and time, we find answers to many questions of modernity, realizing that our past is not only a list of dates and facts, but also a living source of wisdom and warning. The movement of the fleet in those days was an attempt to break out of a trap, and although this breakthrough cost enormous sacrifices, it demonstrated the indomitable will of people in a hopeless situation. The ships that arrived in Kronstadt were wounded, their crews exhausted, but they brought with them hope for the continuation of the struggle. This hope became the fuel that allowed besieged Leningrad to withstand the subsequent long months of the blockade. Thus, even in the very heart of the catastrophe, the seeds of future resilience were laid, which ultimately changed the course of all history. Reflecting on the events of August 1941, we inevitably come to the conclusion about the need for a balance between the iron will of the command and care for each individual. The tragedy of the Tallinn Passage is an eternal reminder that any system is only as strong as it is able to protect its weakest member in a moment of greatest danger. This knowledge remains relevant even today, when technologies and strategies change, but the essence of human nature and the value of life remain unchanged. Concluding our immersion in this complex and multifaceted history, we again turn our gaze to the horizon, where sky and water merge. Where once the glow of fires flared and explosions sounded, today peace reigns. But this peace is deceptive. It is filled with the voices of those who remained in history forever, becoming part of the great and tragic narrative of the Tallinn Passage. We hear them in the sound of the surf and the rustle of the wind, reminding ourselves that history is not what happened, but what lives in us today, shaping our vision of the world and our future. Centuries will pass, eras will change, but the memory of the Baltic Tsushima will be passed from mouth to mouth as a warning and as a symbol of endless courage. Those who made decisions and those who carried them out, those who waited for salvation and those who gave it. All of them became participants in a drama whose scale is difficult to grasp with the mind. But it is precisely in this grasp that our task as guardians of memory lies. Not to let oblivion swallow names and feats, not to let dry figures hide living pain and living glory. In this context, every preserved document, every eyewitness's memory acquires the value of pure gold. We reconstruct the picture of those days bit by bit, realizing that the full truth may be even harsher than we imagine. But it is precisely such truth that we need, because only on a solid foundation of authenticity can we build a future in which such tragedies become impossible. The Tallinn Passage is a lesson written in blood and salt water, and our duty is to learn it to the end. Looking into the distance of the Gulf of Finland, we understand that the history of this campaign is not merely a military chronicle. It is an epic about man in the wind of history, about his weakness and his greatness. It is a story of how, in the darkest of times, the light of self-sacrifice is born, and how even in the chaos of retreat, dignity can be preserved. May this light guide us through the mists of modernity, reminding us that every sunset is invariably followed by a sunrise, and every tragedy by rebirth and new life. The vastness of the sea still holds many untold secrets, and the Tallinn Transit is just one of them. But this story occupies a special place in our consciousness, connecting past and present with invisible threads of shared experience. We are the heirs of this memory, and it is within our power to ensure that the lessons of August 1941 serve for the good of humanity, reminding us of the pricelessness of peace and the necessity of wisdom in managing the destinies of people. May the silence of the Baltic never again be disturbed by the rumble of war. and may ships leaving ports always reach their destination safely. The memory of those who remained at Cape Juminda will forever illuminate our path, like an unfading lighthouse pointing the way in the stormy sea of history. We remember, we are proud, and we hope that future generations will be able to avoid the trials that befell the heroes and victims of the Tallinn transit. With this, we conclude our journey through the waves of time, leaving the heroes of this drama in the eternal peace of their maritime abode. History continues, and each new day adds new pages to the great book of being. But the pages written at the end of August 1941 will forever remain among the deepest and most significant for all of us.